think the biggest challenge we have is literally just getting people to think about that they have a built environment. The roads didn't just appear this way. People made choices to build a road and to stripe it in a certain way that has a certain usage, and to inspire people that can change. So that's really 50% of the battle. If we can convince somebody your built environment can change, then hopefully the next question is, okay, if I want it to change, what do I do?
From Peloton Magazine, this is Around, Episode 6, presented by Canyon. In this episode, contributing editor James Lynch talks to Michael Schneider from Streets for All in Los Angeles to find out how they are making cycling more safe and equitable. His story about how he dusted off an old bike and fell in love with cycling again is worth a listen. He also details the unique and bizarre political climate in Los Angeles. James has also been spending time on the Canyon Grail On, riding gravel in Vermont. So we check in with him on his first impressions of that bike. So, hey, James, tell us a little bit about the new Canyon Grail On that you've been riding in Vermont.
Yeah, so the Grail On is an electric assist gravel bike, which is a really funky beast that I didn't know I wanted so much, but riding it is a pretty awesome experience. A lot of e-bikes that I ride, you see around, are pretty casual geometry, kind of like a beach cruiser, a little bit of bump, or a commuter style bike. But this is cut like the Canyon Grail. It's got the drop bars, it's got the crazy double layered aero bars, and some nice wide tires on it. And it's just an absolute blast to ride. You really notice it when you're going up steep gravel hills. The wide tires give you a lot of good purchase, and you have this great e-assist motor that when you're going, it can as much as triple your power. And so there's a steep hill right near where I live, and it usually takes me about 10 minutes to go up it, and I'm huffing and puffing. And I went with the Grail On, put it in turbo mode, because the Bosch motor has about 4 modes. You have Eco, Tour, Sport, and Turbo. And you put it on turbo mode, and you're getting that full assist. And it was like I was pedaling along the beach, and I'm just crushing up this hill. As fun as could be. You get that tour through the woods or the gravel road you want, but maybe if you're not the person who loves crushing miles, or maybe you're trying to keep up with a friend who rides a lot more than you, or if you live somewhere and you're having friends that come to visit, you don't usually ride, but you want them to tag along with you, this would be a great fit for that, because you still get that good, fun, aggressive gravel riding, but with a ton of power to push you up the steeper stuff.
I'm James Lynch with Around on Bikes, and today we are talking with Michael Schneider, the founder of Streets for All, an LA-based organization making cycling more equitable and available for all people. Michael, how you doing?
Pretty good, James. How about you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Working in the cycling space in Los Angeles, a very car-dominated city, what got you headed towards thinking about reimagining transportation in Los Angeles?
Well, I have to say, I'm born and raised here, and I was a huge car guy for most of my life. I was that person that would get in my car, drive a few blocks to the supermarket, complain there wasn't enough parking, and then drive home. What changed everything for me was the financial crisis in 2009, 2010, and ultimately led to me rethinking my life and giving up my big expensive lease and dusting off an old bicycle and really challenging my state of mind that no one bikes in LA and that you have to have a car and that cycling in Los Angeles is just crazy and impossible. And once I realized it wasn't impossible and maybe it was still a little crazy, I started to fall in love with the lifestyle of feeling great physically and mentally just by getting to where I needed to go, never being late because it was rush hour. And never having to look for parking, and in fact getting free VIP parking anywhere I went right in front. So those are the positive things. But as my wife and I started to have kids, and as I started to take my young children on the bike with me, when a car passes you with 3 inches to spare instead of 3 feet, or honks at you, when you have your kids on your bike, it's a totally different level of frustration and sort of anger at the state of cycling in Los Angeles. I resent that I need to risk my life just to get around town outside of a car. Not only is that not equitable, especially if you can't afford a car, but it's really unique in transportation. Drivers usually don't get in their car and think, I might die today just getting to where I'm going. That's not usually something that crosses their mind. So what got me on the path to Streets for All is a couple of years ago, I was trying to understand the landscape. Why is Los Angeles have such poor cycling infrastructure? We have probably the best weather in the world of any major city. I think we have about 20 days of rain total on average per year. We have a relatively flat city. I found out that the majority of trips in LA County are under 3 miles. So that's a very easy 15-minute casual speed bike ride. And we have a mayor that is now the chair of the C40 and touts LA as a leader of the Green New Deal. I mean, all of these things didn't add up. Why do we have all the politicians saying one thing and wanting to change things, and we're still widening freeways and not reallocating space for protected bike lanes? So I started to get involved, and Streets for All was the culmination of that effort, because I realized that the city council in Los Angeles has an unusual amount of power. There are 15 city council members that represent the entire city. You can contrast that with a city like New York City that has 52 council members. Each council member in Los Angeles oversees about 250,000 people. They make more money than members of Congress do as a salary. And they have an enormous amount of power to decide what does or doesn't happen in their district. So what the problem with that is, you have some council members that are very pro future mobility, bike lanes, things like that. And you have some council members that are the opposite. And when you're just going around Los Angeles, the average person is not thinking, I'm in Council District 11. I just crossed into Council District 5. That's not how we think. Sure. But our bike network, or lack thereof, reflects often the values of those council members. And so that's a problem. And Streets for All is really out there to do two important things. One, we want to change culture. We want to inspire people. We want to let them know about projects where they could get involved, show up at a meeting, these days virtually, make their voice heard, and try to change the city for the better. But we are also a political organization, and we want to help elect progressive people to city council. So we can actually get a majority on the city council of people that believe, I'm not just going to say I care about climate change. I'm actually going to make the on the ground hard decisions to help people, those that want to, get out of their cars and get into a greener form of transportation that is just better for everybody.
So obviously there's the political aspect of things I'd love to dive in a bit, but more on the on the street environment, on your saddle, in the streets environment. For people listening, I imagine that it's hard to imagine an American city less friendly to cycling. And just that, I think the idea of LA is this big this big car city, the big freeways, the highways. I mean, even just pop culture, there's so much car culture involved there. Have you really felt like you're swimming against the tide as you try to get more people on bikes? Or as you start doing these things, are you finding people who are hopping on and being like, oh, I actually really would like to ride my bike too? Or I'm seeing the downsides of being stuck in traffic all day. I want to on my bike. What's the feeling when you interact with people and tell them what you do?
Well, there's the loud minority in Los Angeles of people that complain about traffic. Nobody likes traffic.
Sure.
I haven't met one person yet. But how you solve traffic, people come at it from very different angles. So there's a loud minority of people that are generally the ones that donate to political campaigns, show up at neighborhood council meetings and city council meetings, yell and scream, and kind of get their way, even though they're minority. That truly, if you ask them what they want, maybe they want to go back to the 1950s where there were way fewer cars and you could get in your car and park for free right in front of where you wanted to go and go in and go home.
Sure.
That isn't possible anymore. And so I don't really hear a solution from people that say, oh God, you can't take my vehicle traffic lane and give it to the cyclist. No one bikes in LA anyway. I love hearing that and asking them, if there was a highway that was a beautifully paved highway that went for a mile and became a dirt road with potholes after that. How many cars would drive on that highway? Not that many. That is the equivalent of biking in Los Angeles. You have bike lanes that frankly aren't even that great. They're usually in the door zone, and then they just end. And whoever is biking needs to figure out how to get to the next safe place they can bike. That is never going to be a solution that gets many people interested in actually considering cycling as a reasonable alternative to the car. And I guess what really frustrates me is LA is stuck in sort of this 1980s, 1990s mentality of widening roads and just nearly all the spaces for cars. But we've seen the way this plays out. Look at pictures of Amsterdam in the 60s and traffic jams, and look at it today. Look what happened in Copenhagen. Look what's happening in Paris and London and Bogota today. And even in the US, I mean, you look at places like Boulder and Minneapolis, New York City in the last 10 years, San Francisco, and change can happen really, really quickly when political leaders have the courage to tell people, I get that you don't necessarily love this, but we're going to try this and see, because our city isn't sustainable the way it's going. So one of the things I believe is, so Los Angeles has one of the lowest rates of commuting to work. It's under 1%. I think Portland is around 6%, perhaps, maybe 7%.
You go to bike commuting?
Bike commuting.
Bike commuting. Okay, perfect.
You go to places in Europe, and stats in Copenhagen, for example, the other extreme, I think it's like 55% of all trips into the center of Copenhagen are done by bike. But when you have under 1% in Los Angeles, it means that only the bravest people are doing it. Usually, other than maybe myself, parents are not taking their kids to school on a bike. They're not getting groceries on a bike. They're not running their errands, and they're not going to their office. And so what we need to get to the next maybe 5% of people that might be interested, if they've just never even thought about it. But if you spoke to them in the right way, they might be interested. They might be willing to try it. If they had access to a bike, if they had someone help them plan a route, they may be interested. And so I'm convinced that there is a silent majority in Los Angeles that would love this, especially younger people, that's being held back by a very loud, mostly older minority that doesn't want to change at all.
When you think about making these changes and making it, more available so that not only the bravest are doing it, but families are doing it and young people are doing it, and it's a reasonable and safe way to get around, what are the major infrastructure changes that you'd like to see? Is it just wider bike lanes, or is it bike lanes completely separate from the road? Like, what are some of those big products that you would hope would come to fruition?
So our last mayor, Villaraigosa, my understanding of the story is he went to Copenhagen, got inspired, came back, started biking around LA, was on Venice Boulevard, fell and broke his elbow in the bike lane. And he said, this is bullshit. We need to improve cycling in Los Angeles. And he was a driving force of, I want to say, a couple 100 miles of bike lanes that were laid in the final years of his term. So what they did is they said, let's take a road in Los Angeles. We have very wide roads compared to many other cities. And let's squeeze out bike lanes where we don't have to give up parking or any vehicle traffic lanes. Let's just put them where they fit, basically. And they did that. But the problem is now all those opportunities are gone. There are no more places in Los Angeles, or very few, where you can just paint a bike lane and not have to give something up and have a trade-off. What I would like to see is infrastructure. My wife is a really good example. Her office is about 4, maybe 5 miles from our house. You can get there almost on all residential streets or streets that have bike lanes. And she's too scared to ride her bike to work and home. And it takes her sometimes pre-COVID twice as long as it would take me to bike coming home because of traffic. So she's a great example. She's interested, but she is much more cautious and fearful. And I believe there's a lot of people in the city that are like that. So what do we need? I think we need curb level protected bike lanes, European style, that makes someone from 8 to 80 years old feel safe. I also love the idea of wider sidewalks just for people in general. The average sidewalk width in the city of Los Angeles is 4.5 feet. It's not even wide enough to pass someone during COVID and maintain social distancing. And so that's what I would like. How do we get there? Well, the configuration of most streets in Los Angeles, commercial streets, is parallel parking on both sides of the street, 2 vehicle traffic lanes in each direction, and a center turn lane in the middle. I don't know if you know this, but LA used to have the largest train system in the world in the 1920s. It was the red car system. And you can read about it. If you ever saw Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it touched on the conspiracy around it. But long story short, car and tire companies essentially bought up the holding companies, starved them of maintenance dollars. And then when people rode the train less and less, they're like, oh, look, no one rides the train anyway. Let's just give the space to cars. And they replace them with buses sometimes. The best example of that is in Beverly Hills. If you're going down Santa Monica Boulevard, there's a series of parking garages, free 2-hour parking. That's where the train used to run. And so when you look at this, there's a lot of streets in Los Angeles that are even wider than normal, where they used to have trains. Those streets usually have 3 vehicle lanes of traffic, not 2. And parking and a center turn lane. So it's like a highway. It's like a 9-lane highway. And so I think that the most politically feasible option is probably a reduction of vehicle traffic lanes as opposed to parking. Parking seems to be the third rail in this town. Sure. So that's probably the most realistic, but I would love to expand sidewalks and provide curb level protected bike lanes when possible. If you can't do that or it's too expensive to pour all the concrete, I would love to see parking protected bike lanes with bollards. I think either one of those, if you did a network of them, the 1% of people that bike could go up to 4, 5, 6% pretty quickly given our weather.
When you're thinking about this, and I think there are a lot of people who, ride bikes in their own town, but think like my town isn't ready to make this big change. But then when you hear about, you working in Los Angeles, which seems like the biggest, impediment to the cycling world, a tougher playing field than most. What have you found to be the effective ways to make those political pushes and, try to get that change going? So I know you were speaking a lot of Streets for All is also, being this progressive organization, finding people who support the concerns you have. What's been effective? And what's your strategy been to make those changes?
To inform people and bring out the silent majority. I'll give you a very specific example. LA has a neighborhood council system that's kind of unique to Los Angeles. I think it's one of the largest grassroots experiments of democracy of any city. There are 99 neighborhood councils in Los Angeles. The boards are elected representatives. I'm on the board of my neighborhood council, so I went door to door asking people to vote for me, and there was an election, and I got elected. And these neighborhood councils can't legislate. They don't have any lawmaking power, but they have a lot of influence over the council members who can legislate. And so it's important when a neighborhood council is considering something for people to show up, and the meetings are all public and anyone can make comment on an item in support or against it. So I'll give you a very specific example. UCLA is in Westwood. It's in West Los Angeles. And the Westwood Neighborhood Council late last year had a motion on its very conservative board to oppose a bike lane on Westwood Boulevard between the UCLA campus and the future train stop, where we have the largest investment in subway construction in the country right now. And so there's about to be a subway under Wilshire Boulevard right there. We heard about this and we emailed and spread through social media the message. And I think we got 9 or 10 people to show up at the meeting and make public comments saying they wanted a bike lane on Westwood Boulevard. We got students out there from UCLA saying, I don't want to risk my life, but I can't afford a car, that kind of stuff. So I think actions like that, the first step is just even knowing it's happening. Most people aren't even aware of the neighborhood council system. They don't really think about the fact that their built environment can change. And so when you start telling people, hey, if you live in this part of town, this project's being considered, but it's not a sure thing. You got to show up and make your voice heard. That sort of activates people. And so I want to build one of the largest lists of people that care about this stuff of any big city. And then I want to inform people so they can decide what they care about and potentially show up and make their voice heard. Those things really matter. At the Westwood meeting, unfortunately, we didn't get our way. It's a very conservative board, but we actually flipped a couple of board members that heard all these comments and like, you know what? That kind of makes sense to me. I'm going to change my opinion. And so it's a process, but I think we can get there.
And is this certainly, do you think, a movement that will have to be grassroots just based on the separation of power right now, that the older, more entrenched powers are going to not want to change? And if we want these things to change, it's going to be a community support kind of thing?
I don't think it has to be grassroots. I think if we had strong leadership from the mayor's office on this stuff, it wouldn't necessarily have to all be people doing the heavy lifting. Let me give you another kind of crazy example.
Yeah.
LA in 2015 passed a mobility plan. The idea behind the mobility plan was we're too car reliant. And so how can we make the bus more attractive? How can we make cycling more attractive to help people get out of cars? So the mobility plan is full of bike lanes, a lot of them protected, and bus lanes. So instead of the bus taking twice as long compared to a car, maybe it takes half the amount of time because it has its own lane at rush hour.
Sure.
And so this makes a lot of sense. And the city council, after a lot of debate and outreach, passed this mobility plan. Here's the crazy part. LA typically only implements new bike lanes when they're repaving a street. And LA has some, it's a crazy number. This may be way inflated, but I want to say it's something like 20,000 lane miles of road or some crazy high number. It's really big. And so when you repave the street, it's an opportunity to implement the mobility plan. The crazy part is we often repave streets and don't implement the mobility plan. And then we don't repave those streets again for another 20 or 30 years when the asphalt's bad enough that you need to repave. And so you ask yourself, why would the city council go through all this trouble to create this plan, do the outreach, pass the plan, and then we don't follow the plan? And the reason for that is it's a plan. It's not an ordinance. It's not a law that says you have to do this. It's a suggestion that you do this. And council members can block implementation of a plan. And so my point is, we spend a ton of time rallying people trying to fight to just get the city's own plan to be followed by the city. And that is a crazy way to spend your time, but that is our reality. What I would love to see is the city council pass an ordinance to say, hey, if something is part of our general plan and we have an opportunity to follow our own plan, let's do it. So then we can just focus on what are the gaps in the plan, how do we improve it, versus let's get the city to just follow its own plan.
When you are talking with these people and like your city council and also spreading awareness in community, we've been talking about that, 1 to 5%, which is easily, or more easily attainable, people who would bike commute. But when you talk about cycling in a city like Los Angeles, how does, equity of transportation play in, or, affordability of living and, making the city a place where more people can more easily move about it, that they don't have to breach that, $20,000 for a car. Like, does cycling make the city more available to more people?
I certainly think it does. Los Angeles has such a weird stigma with public transportation. Unfortunately, it's been that way for decades. And so I truly believe, though, if you make the bus twice as fast as a car at rush hour, despite that stigma, some people that even if they can afford a car will choose the bus because they're going to get home twice as fast.
Right.
With cycling, it's absolutely an equity issue. There's a lot of people that can't afford a car. And the unfortunate irony of this is the single place in Los Angeles that's probably best for cycling right now is downtown Los Angeles, which is great. But a lot of the jobs that people need to get to are more west of downtown Los Angeles. And as you get further west, you get into more politically conservative territories that don't necessarily want to make cycling easier or take space away from cars. And so people that can't afford cars are riding on the sidewalk or they're riding in the street, but they don't feel comfortable and risking their lives just to get to work. So there's a huge equity aspect here. Also, there was an incident last night that happened in LA, or yesterday, that is fresh on my mind. A man was cycling a black man was cycling in South Los Angeles, and a sheriff started pursuing him for, I don't know the details, but the news article said, code violations relating to biking. So maybe they ran a stop sign, who knows? And this man wound up dead. It's unbelievably tragic. And so when you talk about the mobility justice aspect of this, you got to think about if minorities don't feel comfortable, even if there is a bike lane, because they're being policed by armed men and women, that's a whole other aspect that needs to change. I don't understand why, as a city, we spend the resources to send anyone armed with a gun chasing after somebody on a bicycle for running a stop sign or running a red light. It doesn't make any sense to me. I personally got pulled over by a sheriff a few years ago for running a stop sign. And he had his siren on and his lights, and I was on a bicycle. Right. And so it feels like the enforcement mechanisms for cycling also need to change, and especially to protect minorities. I mean, yesterday's incident is just so tragic.
Is there an opportunity on a bicycle to rehumanize some of these things that may have been dehumanized as we separate people into their individual, steel boxes of cars? Is that a place we can improve on some of these things?
I absolutely think we can. When I bike my daughters to school or to a park or whatever, they notice things they would never notice in a car. They notice the color of a flower or a butterfly, or they ask me questions, and moving at a more human scale pace, you really do see the city differently. I think that it's much more difficult to ignore problems in the community if you really feel them, because you're going at a slower pace through the community. It's much easier to ignore them in a steel box. You just feel kind of insulated. There's been a big debate right now near where I live saying, why would you ever put a bike lane on that street? It's much safer just to be in a car. And it's kind of, that person is against the project, but they're kind of proving my point about safety. But I absolutely believe that, between the connection to nature and seeing your community at a different scale and pace can absolutely help. It can also help with relationships with law enforcement. I like seeing police on bicycles. It's much more approachable than these really scary cars or even Hummers or whatever. So yes, I think that the bicycle can definitely connect you a lot more to both nature and your community.
So it sounds like the bicycle, and also that human pace, the human speed of a bicycle, the fact that you're smelling the things that you're driving by and seeing the things and hearing all these things rather than just, blasting your radio, wherever it might be. It sounds to me, and I've thought this before too, that the bicycle can be a vehicle for being invested in your community and being a part of it and like moving through it, not just like skirting past it in your car. When you look at all of these things, do you have hope for cycling in LA, or are you still in a position where it's like we have a lot of work to do before you can be hopeful about these changes?
I am eternally optimistic, so I will always have hope. I joke with my wife that I should just move to Boulder or Minneapolis or Copenhagen, and I would probably live a lot longer because I would just have the city the way I want, and I wouldn't need to fight so much. But that would be cheating. I want to change it here. This city deserves change. We owe it to our children, we have one of the highest rates of childhood asthma in the country. We all smoke cigarettes every week just by breathing. I mean, there's serious consequences to just having the car be the king of the road. So I always have hope. COVID actually, while I wish, of course, it never happened, one of the silver linings is there's two silver linings. One is something that Streets for All really led the charge on, which was to get Los Angeles to implement slow streets. So we have signage throughout the city. It's an official Department of Transportation program that asks drivers to slow down and essentially makes the streets less interesting to cut through because they're kind of having to dodge these signs, and makes them safer for people walking, running, biking, scooting, etc. So that's been really interesting. And if you asked me if LA would have done that 6 months ago, I would have said no way, because it inconveniences drivers. We also have something called LA Alfresco, which is LA's outdoor dining program to help restaurants survive. And so restaurants are now allowed to use parking spaces, sidewalk space, and starting very soon, street space. The city is buying these huge concrete barriers and actually essentially cordoning off a parking lane, and that becomes an extension of the restaurant's patio, for example. And so, again, if you asked me 6 months ago, would LA ever inconvenience drivers and repurpose parking for dining, I would say no way, and now they're doing it. And there are movements inside city council to try to make both of these things permanent, which is also really interesting. The other thing I'll tell you is that LA is repaving streets a lot faster because of the lull in traffic due to COVID. And so that's an opportunity to get the mobility plan implemented a lot faster as well. So we're keeping track of repaving schedules and fighting very hard each time a corridor comes up that's going to be repaved that's on the mobility plan with a planned bike lane. We're fighting very hard to make sure that's actually implemented. I actually think one of the silver linings of COVID could be a different city when we emerge. And I think it has to be, because imagine if 10 or 20% of bus riders that could afford a car, but so far don't have one, go out and buy one because they're scared of public transit and they don't want to catch a virus. And all of a sudden, not only does all the traffic come back, but it's 10 or 20% worse. I just can't even imagine what that would feel like in the city. And so I think we have to move quickly to give people alternatives.
Well, Streets for All, as we, hopefully at some point transition out of this COVID world into a post-COVID world, what will your efforts be to keep that energy up and try to make those temporary things more permanent and, get people to say, hey, now that you can go back to a car, let's keep going on the bikes. Let's keep that distance. Let's do that. Is it just education, or what are your thoughts?
So we're tracking the city's program of accelerated repaving very closely, and we'll continue to do that through, I guess, the end of the program. But even after, let's say, first of all, I don't think COVID is just going to be done one day and everything's going to go back to normal. I think this virus is going to be with us for a long time. I think even if there's a vaccine, I saw a poll that a third of Americans wouldn't even consider taking the vaccine. So this thing is going to linger even if there's a vaccine. And I think people working from home or staggering the days that go into the office are going to change. And so if all of that is true, that means that traffic patterns in Los Angeles are probably not going to go back to the way it used to be for a very long time, if ever. And again, that is an opportunity for us as a city to rethink how we use the space. But post-COVID, or I should say when COVID isn't the headline every day in the news, we have a great project on Venice Boulevard, which is the only street in Los Angeles that goes from the ocean to downtown entirely in the city of Los Angeles. Every other street cuts through multiple cities. And so we have a project to make that a complete street, which, by the way, is in the city's mobility plan, and add bus lanes and bike lanes. So that's something we'll continue to be very active on. We have another initiative in Hollywood Boulevard. There's a stretch that is the most popular tourist destination in Los Angeles, and the sidewalks aren't wide enough, and people are spilling into the streets, and it's still reserved for cars. So we're going to still fight that battle, and we'll continue to educate people and think about different ways that we can make cycling more accessible, safer, more interesting. I think the biggest challenge we have is literally just getting people to think about, that they have a built environment. The roads didn't just appear this way. People made choices to build a road and to stripe it in a certain way that has a certain usage, and to inspire people that can change. So that's really 50% of the battle. If we can convince somebody your built environment can change, then hopefully the next question is, okay, if I wanted to change, what do I do? And that's where Streets for All comes in and says, all right, get involved, show up to this meeting, help this political candidate win, sign this petition, go make comment at this meeting, email this person about this project. And we basically give people a menu of options to get involved. And long term, I would love Streets for All to inspire other advocacy orgs in other cities and provide them with a template. Here's how to build a website for free or cheap. Here's how to build your email list for free or cheap. Here are templates you can use, wording you can use, suggested motions for your city council, your neighborhood council. Here's how to get volunteers on. If we can provide a toolkit for other people and have, whether it's called Streets for All or anything, I don't care. I want people to copy me, and this isn't a for-profit. And so
sure.
I think that could also be really powerful. And ultimately, just like people go to Europe and marvel, oh, the plazas are so charming and cute, and I loved, having a glass of wine, eating a sandwich in this people plaza. But then they come back home and they assume that can't happen here. And that's just not true. The more cities in the US that start to put people ahead of cars, and the more people move around and travel, they're going to get inspired, and they're going to bring those ideas back home and want that same change in their own city.
If someone's in Los Angeles and wants to get involved with Streets for All, or someone's in another city and wants to learn what you guys are doing, how can they find out more?
Streetsforall.org. And we are at Streets for All on Twitter and Instagram.
Well, fantastic. Michael, thanks so much for all your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, James.
We hope you enjoyed episode 6 from Around. Please visit aroundonbikes.com for more features.